It's been a few weeks, maybe months, but when you want to do something right, you take the time to do it right. With that in mind, welcome to part 2 of my Socialism Sucks series, where I take on socialism and the narratives that are being pushed by its proponents and against capitalism. Welcome in to the Andrew Coppins Show, and as you might have guessed by now, I'm Andrew Coppins. So why a big series on socialism and not the talk of the news of the day or the week for my return? Well, with the rise of socialism amongst the younger set in this country, it is time to deal a dose of facts, as well as our favorite thing, feelings, right back at them. Most importantly, it's time to test our facts, theories, and feelings as well. If we're going to defeat an ideology, you must first understand what the heck it is, the claims it makes, and the claims supporters will make against your preferred ideology. The reality today is that we're in a fight for the economic soul of this country. Will capitalism continue to live on, or will socialism completely take over the United States? Last we left off in part 1, we were understanding the true definition of socialism and debunking what modern American socialists believe it to be, namely taking on the idea that Scandinavian socialism even exists at all. The reality is they are free market capitalist economies with a massive welfare state. But you could check all of that out on the episode that's linked above, or perhaps it's below. Going forward, this series will be all about taking on the narratives and arguments socialists like to make these days. Today, in part 2, I'm taking on a rather new concept and buzzword socialists like to throw around. It's called modern monetary theory. At its core, modern monetary theory, or MMT for short, is the belief that countries that issue their own fiat currency don't have to worry about accumulating too much debt because it could always print more money to pay interest. Bloomberg gives us a real-world example in the following way. Quote, "So the only constraint on spending is inflation, which could break out if the public and private sectors spend too much at the same time. As long as there are enough workers and equipment to meet growing demand without igniting inflation, the government can spend what it needs to maintain employment and achieve goals such as halting climate change," unquote. Keep that last sentence in mind for later in the show. I've got a feeling it's going to come in very handy. But before we get into theory and practice, we also need to understand how this theory came to be and how it came to be a favorite of the socialist left today. First off, it's rather ironic that this theory is called modern because it's not a new theory or philosophy. It's actually been around for some time now, and many consider it an offshoot of Keynesian macroeconomic theory. But what you really need to know is that it was once on the fringe of economist circles, let alone the populace writ large, and today it is the socialist favorite way to explain away massive debt and spending that they advocate for. Modern monetary theory is the brainchild of American economist Warren Mosler, who began kicking around the idea back in the 1970s, so it's really been around for about 50 years now. Mosler's been a teacher, an engineer, a hedge fund founder, and has run for political office literally all over this country. But for our purposes, it's best that you know that he's the co-founder for the Center of Full Employment and Price Stability at the University of Missouri, Kansas City. Last part is perhaps the most important, because it seems as if UMKC is the epicenter of MMT. Most of the big names in economics that are high on this idea magically have congregated at UMKC at one point or another in their career. As for the Center for Full Employment and Price Stability, one could ask, what in the hell does that even mean, right? It billed itself as a nonpartisan policy institute dedicated to promoting research and public discussion of issues related to macroeconomic and monetary policy, especially employment and budgetary policy. I don't know about you, but I just about fell asleep reading through that sentence. I'm sure these guys and gals must be a blast at parties. Look, if you believe this was a nonpartisan group, as they claim to be, consider clicking on the link that's below to its series on healthcare. Not surprisingly, its prescription was government-run healthcare, but the last time it bothered to update its website was a decade ago, and activity from this group seems to have spread elsewhere, which is why I wanted to highlight this group as the roots right here. One such influencer to come out of this group at UMKC was L. Randall Wray, who could now be found at Barrett College running the Levy Economics Institute. Not surprisingly, its Twitter feed reads like an American socialist propaganda arm. Quite literally. There's highlights of all things MMT and its practitioners, advocacy for student loan debt elimination, and of course the socialist favorite talking point, the growing inequality of wealth. Speaking of that whole inequality argument will get a full episode of its own, don't you worry. But our focus is on MMT today, and I only serve to point out the above pieces of information because MMT proponents have long tried to say it has nothing to do with socialism. Yet at every academic turn and every point of policy, they back socialist thought and policy.
Coincidence? I think not!
Why all of this is important is so that you understand the who, what, where regarding MMT's start. As for today's proponents, we have to start to realize this theory isn't fringe anymore, and socialists have begun to embrace it as a way forward for their policy prescriptions for all that ails the country. Just how big of a hold does MMT have in today's politics, you might ask? But all you should need to know is that one of its biggest proponents is Stephanie Kelton. I know you've likely never heard of her before, but you should know her name, because she's the one spreading the gospel of Mosler's theory in politics. In fact, the two have run in the same economic and academic circles for a very long time now. But her immediate influence today is widespread, with the biggest names in socialist circles in America. Kelton has touched some of the most important parts of our government as well, and the private sector too. She used to be the chief economist for the Democratic minority staff of the Senate Budget Committee, before moving on to advise the Bernie Sanders campaign in 2016. She's also rumored to be joining Bernie's 2020 campaign as well. She used to also be the professor of economics at the University of Missouri-Kansas City, and in 2016 was named to Political's 50 thinkers, doers, and visionaries transforming American politics for that year. That's how much influence a modern monetary theorist has today. She's reached the highest of highs when it's dealing with budget issues, has helped one of the frontrunners for the Democratic nomination, who happens to be a full-on socialist, and has spent plenty of her career shaping the minds of our youth. So we have to take her seriously, if for only the simple reason being that she's being taken seriously by socialists and the Democratic policymakers in DC today. All of that comes full circle for me, because one of the biggest question marks that most conservatives have about the most famous socialist in America today, Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez, is how you could get a degree in economics at an American university and say the seemingly bat crap crazy things she has said. Plenty of her economic ideas and policy prescriptions make zero sense to the vast majority of this country. Look, when you've got the Moslers and Keltons and a huge group of academic followers, and they've been teaching at universities over the past 40 years or so, you get an entire generation exposed to professors who don't just teach these ideas, but they're true believers. It results in an entire generation indoctrinated to believe that these ideas are mainstream and workable in the real world. It also has apparently resulted in one political party embracing its practitioners in a major way. So now that we know about the basics, the history, and the who that's involved with MMT, what does it look like in America's politics of today? Well, there are three key aspects of it in far-left politics today: the Green New Deal, single-payer healthcare, and a jobs guarantee. Let's tackle the final part of it first, because I think it's the one that most people have the hardest time getting their heads around. It also happens to be the one that helps explain more of the intricacies surrounding MMT. Look, so for MMT to work, you not only have to control inflation, but you also need full employment. It's that balancing act that gives us the job guarantee from the government. Remember, MMTers will tell you till they're blue in the face that this theory is not tied to socialism, but a job guarantee from the freaking government? It's literally a tenet of socialism, and if we really want to get technical, communism more specifically. So what does a job guarantee actually mean in practice? Well, we'll go to the leftist favorite website for that, Vox.com, which states the following. The basic concept is that the government would offer, as a right of citizenship, a job at minimum wage, usually $15 an hour for these purposes, with benefits, working for the government or a nonprofit to any adult who wants one. Furthermore, there's a reason why this is supposed to be in place according to the theory of MMT. It's all about wage control, again from Vox. The idea behind such a sweeping and universal program in the context of MMT is to ensure full employment, no matter what policies the government is adopting to fight inflation. Indeed, the job guarantee is in part a way to keep wages down, or at least keep them from continually rising to prevent an inflationary spiral. I want you to think about this. MMT is literally saying wages need to be kept down. Hard work, productivity, creativity, and all the things that make people more valuable as they move up in their careers aren't to be rewarded anymore. They're a burden to MMT proponents. Additionally, the job guarantee would work as the lever to control recessions. It's also magically set to the leftist favorite economic fight of the past decade, that $15 minimum wage. Vox openly states the following about what a job guarantee program would do to the job market. Setting The job guarantee wage at the minimum wage is important for anchoring inflation. In tight labor markets, employers sometimes choose to increase wages and then pay for the change with higher prices, setting off inflation. But if the JG wage is tethered to the minimum, then employers always have the option of hiring workers from the JG pool who, under the theory, can be hired at the low fixed wage given to them in the JG program. That gives them a way to avoid raising wages and setting off price increases. Interestingly, the American union movement has been a huge proponent of the jobs guarantee. All of it makes little sense to me. Someone will need to explain how depressing wages is a positive thing for America's future. The natural effect of this type of guarantee means wages will regress to the mean of whatever the government will guarantee. This theory provides no incentive for workers to advocate for higher wages or employers to provide those higher wages than is absolutely necessary for anything. You don't have to take my word for it, though. One only has to look at a government guarantee that happens today: Pell Grants and student loans. Amazingly, prices have gone up at public universities and those private ones that take federal money to the tune of pretty much exactly whatever the maximum the loans will pay out. The only difference is that this is the economic reverse, as businesses see a way to cut wages and keep profits higher than before. If you can pay less for the same work and get similar results, why wouldn't you do that? Such is the major hole in MMT thinking, but there's still two more points with modern monetary theory. So let's move forward to talking about the Green New Deal and single-payer healthcare in the same sense. For MMT, these two are really the same thing, because it's the proposed answer to questions conservatives often ask: how do you pay for it all? Their answer: debt like this doesn't matter because the United States can just pay for it with printing more money and a few structural changes. How would that be accomplished? Well, without getting too far into the weeds, let's just say it involves an agreement by the Federal Reserve Bank to lower interest rates to 0% on a permanent basis and then to stop issuing T-bonds. Next, it requires us to realize that the government will spend the money to bring it into existence in the first place. It's exactly the opposite of how we think about money today, in that taxes are actually collected so that the government can then circulate the money. I know what you're probably thinking, because it's the same thing I've been thinking. But what about inflation? And more importantly, hyperinflation? This is where MMT completely falls apart for me. You know how I know it? It's called Venezuela. Its socialist economy ran much like MMTers would like the United States to run. The government controlled wages, issuance of its own currency, and then hoped to prosper despite racking up major deficits along the way. It wouldn't really matter though, because they could control the labor market in a major way. By the end, what happened? It all fell apart, and Venezuela's currency became worthless. They flooded the market with money to pay off debt, because they valued foreign currency, mainly the US dollar. Once the dollar became very strong, the Venezuelan bolivar became weak. Printing more money didn't do the trick, and it combined with an uncontrollable decline in the labor market to put the country into the ditch. In other words, just like the Weimar Republic in Zimbabwe before, service of foreign debt killed its economy. Could that happen in the United States? Hell yes, it could. Because the fundamental flaw of MMTers is believing that the United States dollar will be the accepted international currency going forward forever. Imagine a world in which that ceases to be the case. Please do. Now imagine the United States suddenly is called on its debt service in whatever new currency rules the world economy. Say the Chinese renminbi, for example. You now have a currency, the United States, that isn't worth what it once was on the international market. 30% of your debt is now owed to creditors in a new currency, and suddenly you have to flood your own market with tons of new money to make it up. That's also isn't worth what it once used to be because you said so back in the day. That's a major problem, but one that may not throw us into a completely dead economy. But even at 30% owed in a different currency, it would make the Great Depression look like the Gilded Age by comparison. Now imagine we pass nearly $120 trillion in more spending than we have cash on hand to pay for things as a government. That's what the Green New Deal and government-run healthcare would add to our debt according to the most conservative estimates out there. How, even in MMT's most rosy of projections, can the United States survive adding that kind of debt and the needed cash infusion to pay for just the interest on that kind of debt? There's no way adding trillions more in currency to the mix doesn't add up to inflation or wage depression or massive unemployment issues. Modern monetary theory is just that, a theory. More importantly, it's a flawed theory that has never been tried in practice. Yes, even with massive debts already in place in the United States. The closest governments to getting this theory going in practice have all ended in major failures too. Yet we're supposed to just jump off the cliff and believe in Kelton and Mosler being right without any real proof that their models actually work on a grand scale, let alone a small one. Much like everything else with socialism, we have a theory that sounds warm and fuzzy on paper, but not so much when you bring it to its logical conclusions. Look, I don't claim to know everything and every detail and intricacy on modern monetary theory, but I hope this does give you a high level insight into the basics and what its proponents are trying to sell to the American people. To me, this is a very dangerous theory to follow. There are just too many controls and levers that our government, which can't even control its current debt and budget correctly, would have at its disposal. One false move, and it'll come tumbling down faster than a Jenga tower. I'm just simply not willing to turn our future as a country over to something so tenuous. I hope you enjoyed this trip down the socialist nightmare path. Don't forget, you can hit that subscribe button and that notification bell so you don't miss a single episode. I'll be hopefully back with a regular show in a quick order. Until then, follow me on the socials at The Coppin Show and keep being the amazing people you are.